Welcome to the ThromboWatch podcast, where we explore the real-life impact of blood clotting disorders and how they shape the lives of individuals and families. Today we're sharing the story of Louise Thompson, who discovered she has Factor V Leiden, a genetic condition that increases the risk of blood clots. Louise's journey is deeply personal, spanning generations of her family, and she sheds light on the importance of awareness, prevention, and early diagnosis. Stay with us as we uncover her experience and discuss what this means for others who may be at risk. Let's get started.
Hello everyone. In today's podcast, we'll be talking about the story of Louise Thompson, how and when she got Factor V Leiden deficiency, and how will this impact you and your future. So welcome, Louise.
Thank you. Great to be here doing this with you. So my story starts in 1972. In 1972, my grandma was 53 years old and she died of a stroke. And what everybody said at the time was, it's just one of those things. It's sad, It's one of those things. If you go fast forward 30 years, my dad developed blood clots in his knee. And at first nobody recognised it was a blood clot and they thought it was arthritis. He didn't have any redness, as you often have with a blood clot. He just had pain. And eventually he was diagnosed with a blood clot and he was placed on warfarin, which is a blood thinner, and they said, well, that's it, now you're on warfarin, it won't happen again, it was just one of those things, and you won't have any more blood clots, you're fine, just go about your life. And he was about 64 at this time, and he went about his life for about a month before he clotted again. And he clotted again, and so he ended up with blood clots from groin to ankle. Fortunately, they never broke off, which is something that you might tell us about later could happen. They didn't break, but what did happen is that his legs just broke out because they weren't getting enough blood supply, so they turned purple, and then the skin broke down, and it was really, really difficult for him to keep his legs intact after that. So he was at risk of a lot of infections. It meant that he struggled to walk, and he later developed vascular dementia.
Okay.
And around about that time too, I was in my mid-30s and I was very keen to start a family, and I found that I was having recurrent miscarriages. And what they said to me was, it's just one of those things, Louise. There's no reason for it. You just one of those things. Just go home and try again. And this went on for a little while. Every time I got pregnant, at about 10 weeks, I would lose the baby. It was obviously hugely difficult time, very, very sad. And it had a huge impact on me at the time. And eventually we decided to try for IVF because I was heading towards 40. It was getting quite desperate. So I went for IVF. And one of the questions that I had in my IVF workup was, anybody in the family have blood clots?
Okay. And
I said, oh yeah, my dad has had lots of blood clots, yes. Well, we'll do an extra test. That'd be an extra £500, please, because it was private. So I happily paid that for this test. Didn't really think any more of it. I was really excited to be starting the IVF journey. Remember, this is sort of the late 2005, 6, 7 sort of time. I was really excited, waiting for the call for my IVF, and I got a call to go back and see them. And what they said was, we have found that you have Factor V Leiden, which I've never heard of. It's, well, you can talk about this better than I can, but it's effectively, as I understood it, a faulty gene that means that my blood is more prone to clotting. And so what they said was, you can't have IVF because we can't give you the hormone therapy that would be needed.
Yeah. So
it's just something you're going to have to live with. Thank you and goodbye. Which I didn't see that coming. I thought anyone can have IVF. It seemed like it was quite a common thing. I didn't think that they were going to say no to me. So I had to live with that. But then I also had to find out, what is this Factor V Leiden? Because it seemed like maybe it had affected my grandmother with her stroke. Maybe it had affected my dad with his blood clots, and maybe later, and certainly the breakdown of his skin on his legs, and maybe even vascular dementia. And it affected me in that I couldn't have children, and it affected my children in that I couldn't keep them alive, which is something that I have to carry with me. So taking all of that, Dr. Sharma, what would you say, obviously not just to my case, but in general, what sort of things did that story make you think about that could help the people watching our podcast?
I mean, at so many levels, it's just not the scientific thing that you were talking about. As a human, the emotions, you know, as you said, your grandmom had it and it carried on for so many generations. So I think the social impact it had on you, the financial, the emotional, all of these, I would say, spheres in life were affected just because you had a genetic sort of variance in which your body is producing more clots.
Right, it had a huge impact on my family. My granddad had to spend almost the second half of his life without the love of his life. I was unable to progress our family name, which is something that I really wanted to be able to do. Yeah. So my parents didn't get grandchildren from me. Yeah. My dad was forced to give up work much sooner than he would have wanted to. Yeah. So it had economic and emotional impacts on all of us. And I was the one that was diagnosed with the gene following that blood test. But is it likely that my dad and my grandmother had the same condition, and how would that be?
Very good question. So I mean, it's really difficult to go retrospective and give it a thought. But of course, if someone has Factor V Leiden, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a sort of disease. I mean, you've got an additional risk factor on the top of the other risk factors which usually come and play a big role in our lives. So for instance, for you, Louise, right, you've got Factor V. Unfortunately, you had to bear the consequences, or you may say the harmful effects of it. But most of the other life-threatening complications related with Factor V can be prevented. And that's why we're doing this podcast, to make you guys aware that even if you've got this problem, you can still be protected from the life-threatening complications. Yes, of course, life's not perfect. It hasn't been perfect for you, Louise, and I can feel the emotion that you're carrying with you.
Trying to keep it in.
Yes, but for you guys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, if you've got Factor V, as we've said, yes, it will have implications. But the job for us to go ahead from this time onwards is to stop the harmful effects, as in the life-threatening complications, which you would have heard. People get deep in thrombosis, people might get pulmonary embolisms, people might get stroke, heart attacks and whatnot. So, Louise, my question to you back now is, okay, you got diagnosed with Factor V. What did you do about it then?
So, I was first of all, I had to find out what it was and do some research, and there wasn't very much given to me. I was told I had it. I was told I couldn't have children. I couldn't have HRT. So I later had to go through the menopause without any help either. But where I knew it would take effect was if I flew. I quite often had to fly for work. I had to fly for holidays. So if I was flying, I was very aware that I needed to take protection. So that means for me flight socks, which look great on an aeroplane, but and aren't the most comfortable, and they're hot. But I would always wear flight socks to boost my circulation. I would make sure that I was walking around the plane quite often, as much as I was allowed to do. I certainly wouldn't drink alcohol on a plane. I don't drink a lot of alcohol anyway, and it always gives me an instant bad head. But I definitely wouldn't drink on a plane, and I would just be very mindful if I finished a flight and then if I developed a pain in my calf or anything else. So I was alert to the fact that could be a risk factor. So there's a load of things here that I'd love to get into in the course of this podcast. First of all, can you tell me a little bit about a faulty gene? What does that mean? And I know that I have one copy of that faulty gene. Does everybody have one copy, or is there more to it than that? Can you tell us a bit more about it?
Great question. So we as humans are made up of the DNA, right? And there are various things that constitute the DNA, including the expression from our parents, which we call as the genetic expression. So what can happen is, as you said, faulty gene. That gene might not be doing the exact sort of job it was meant to do, and it's acting a bit weird. It's acting like a lone ranger and doing its own stuff. So what essentially happens is we get symptoms with it. Their expression gets symptom. So now, for instance, you said you had a single copy. I'll go a bit technical. We have two sort of things here, which we call as the heterozygous and the homozygous. Don't worry, I'll break it down for you guys. So now, if one parent with one single copy passes that defaulty gene to you, you are a heterozygous. So you will have symptoms, but if both of your parents have the same sort of defective gene and they pass it on to you, you become homozygous. So you become more stronger defect. Okay, so what happens is a homozygous Factor V Leiden deficiency person might have some symptoms, might have the increased risk of developing clots, but if it's the same homozygous one, they have the highest risk, I would say, of developing those blood clots. So now you would be thinking, oh, this guy is talking so much of blood clots. Each and every one of us have a normal mechanism of forming clots in our body. Simple example, you cut your arm off, there's a big deep cut, you'll have the bleeding, but after some time the bleeding stops because your body is meant to stop it. And that's why we need blood clots. Otherwise you'll keep bleeding and you might die of the bleeding. Okay, but now what happens is, just because there's a change in the dynamics in the body, your clot formation is at a very higher pace than it should have been. And that's what leads to increased formation of clots. Factor V, as I said, is a high risk factor for these sort of clotting disorders. We'll talk more about the clotting disorders in the next podcast, but for coming back to your question. Yes, unfortunately, if the parent has passed it on, you will live with it. Okay, you might have the clinical implications of it, but as I keep on saying, we can still prevent the harmful, life-threatening complications.
So if the people watching this are aware that they have had parents who've had blood clots, do you suggest that they seek testing? Is there a way to get tested other than going for an IVF workup that I did? I actually know that things like DNA, things like 23andMe test DNA.
Yeah.
So I actually did do my DNA testing sometime later, and it did record that I had Factor V Leiden.
Yeah.
If I wasn't aware of it and prepared for it, that might have been a big shock. So, few things. Would you recommend that people get tested if they recognise that they had clots in their family? I think that's sometimes known as a thrombosis as well. People might have heard it in the family as, Auntie Ethel had a thrombosis. So we've said that it might not be because of Factor V Leiden that someone has a clot, but it might be. So do you think people should get tested?
Good question, Louise. I mean, when we talk about the blood clot disorders per se, as I've told, you'll get two sort of groups in that. In one, you've got thrombotic problems. You get more sort of thrombus formation. The other one is bleeding problem, where you've got some issue with the bleeding getting a bit more uncontrolled. So, I mean, on a regular routine basis, the investigation is not recommended. Okay, you go and find the literature. For instance, even in the UK, for instance, even if we diagnose someone with Factor V Leiden, we're not going to treat the person then and there. The reason being, if they're not symptomatic with it, they don't need a treatment. Yes, when it comes to special instances, like in your case, when we're talking about trouble conceiving, yes, that's an entirely different story, and we need a good sort of input from the gynecologist, the hematologist, and people who can make bold decisions, because yes, it's a double-edged sword here. If you give hormone replacement, your clotting trouble the risk becomes higher. If you've already got a genetic problem, it goes at the highest threshold. And what we can see here is person dying from a clot related problem, then the associated life-related problems of the factor V. So in a routine world, as you say, there are the firms in the United States which do these testing, and people go and do it by themselves. So I mean, I'm not going to recommend it or not recommend it, but yes, if you've got history in your family where people have had blood clot related problems, you might would have blood clot related problems, and you're thinking in 10 different directions of why this is there, why could that these been or that be. I mean, getting the test per se is not going to solve the problem, but it at least going to enlighten you a bit more. You get a clearer conscious, okay, I've got factor V, or I've got antiphospholipid syndrome, I've got protein C, protein S deficiencies. I mean, as I said, we will talk about this in a later podcast. But if you've got the problem, the solution is what matters the most. As I said, these conditions, unfortunately, these are inherited conditions. So we can't stop them from being inherited, I would say, isn't it? Because if you've already inherited it, we can't chop that gene off and send it off somewhere else. What we can do essentially is prevent. So the reason we are talking here is more emphasis on the prevention, so that you don't suffer alone, you don't suffer in silence. There is help available, but yes, it's mostly on the technical bits. What we're trying to offer is the human component of the help that can, make changes in your life.
Yeah, so the things that I talked about, for example, when I get on a plane,
Yeah.
they're advice that anybody could take, whether
Yeah.
they are known to be at risk of more blood clots than others or not. They're sensible precautions.
Yeah.
So maybe as we go through this podcast, we will talk more about things that people can do to stay healthy, whether or not they're at risk. But obviously, in doing that, it will reduce any risk that's there if they are managing those risk factors, whether they have them or not. It's a sensible thing to do.
Absolutely.
Shall we talk more in future podcasts about that?
Absolutely.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical, legal, or financial advice. Opinions expressed are the personal views of the ThromboWatch team. If you think you may have developed a new blood clot, please speak to your healthcare provider urgently. Health-related information on this podcast, including text, graphics, images, and other material, is for educational purposes only, and therefore not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. If you think you have a medical emergency, call 999 in the UK, and for less urgent assistance, call 111.